She was a dreamy young woman who believed in love and dreamed of building a family, but her greatest dream turned into the nightmare of an abusive relationship that nearly took her life. Fleeing to survive, she collapsed exhausted on the porch of a widower who had given up on love. Neither of them knew it, but that unexpected encounter would forever change their destinies and hearts. Zoe Adeyemi grew up in the quiet town of Ipetu, where mornings began with the song of birds and the aroma of fresh bread wafting through the narrow streets. From a young age, she carried within her the feeling that the world was much bigger than that patch of land. The townspeople said she had eyes that see far, a way of looking that seemed to pierce through the present and glimpse far ahead, as if she already knew life held something grand for her. She loved simple things, helping her mother in the garden, listening to the elders' stories while sitting on the porch, and feeling the cool breeze on rainy nights. But deep down, she nurtured dreams that stretched far beyond the borders of that town. She wanted to study, graduate, and build a solid career. Some days, she saw herself as an engineer, designing bridges and buildings that would stand as marks of her work. On others, she imagined being a psychologist, listening and helping people find strength amid their pain. For Zoe, the most important thing was to leave a positive mark on the world. She also dreamed of traveling. She kept clippings from magazines with photos of distant cities, golden sandy beaches, blooming fields, and colorful markets. She pictured herself walking through streets she'd never stepped on, tasting new foods and hearing different languages. For her, travel wasn't just leisure, but a way to grow, learn, and bring back new stories to tell. And then there was the dream that, to her, was the most precious, finding the love of her life. She didn't want a fairy tale, but a real love, patient, supportive, and present. She thought about the feeling of having someone to share victories with and to hold her hand on tough days. She imagined her wedding day, a simple white dress, soft music, friends gathered, and the first look exchanged at the altar. Later, she saw herself in a brightly lit home, with walls full of photographs and a yard where her children could run. Sometimes, lying in the hammock on the porch, she closed her eyes and mentally sketched out this future life. She could almost smell the coffee on Sunday mornings, hear the sound of children's laughter, and see herself sitting on the sofa reading while the rain fell outside. For Zoe, these dreams weren't distant fantasies. They were goals, like small lights guiding the path she believed she was following. Little did she know that, as beautiful as her plans were, life was about to test every one of them, and before finding the love she so hoped for, she would have to cross a darkness that was no part of her envisioned future. Stories that move, lessons that transform, and endings that surprise. This is African Village Story. Click subscribe and turn on the bell to not miss a single chapter of this unique experience. Zoe was a very special girl. She had many friends and loved spending time with them whenever she could. They spent afternoons at the market, strolling through the square, or having long conversations sitting on the church steps, watching the town's movements. Friendship and shared laughter kept her heart light, and it was on one of those days, on a dull Sunday afternoon, that Zoe met Daniel Okoro. The square was quieter than usual, the sky covered with grey clouds, and the breeze carried the scent of impending rain. Daniel was at the small corner cafe, leaning on the counter, chatting with the barista. His calm demeanor caught attention, and his open smile contrasted with the serene atmosphere of that day. When their eyes met, there was something almost imperceptible, but intense enough to mark that moment in her memory. Little did Zoe know that from then on, her life would take a new course. It didn't take long for their encounters to become more frequent. First, a wave from afar. Then, short conversations about the weather or some town event. Until one late afternoon, he offered to help her carry heavy market bags to her house. It was a simple gesture, but full of kindness. Daniel, at 24, had a natural charm, an attentive gaze, and a way of speaking that seemed to listen more than it spoke. There was a presence about him that conveyed trust, and at that moment Zoe had no reason to believe otherwise. Their first outings were filled with small courtesies. He'd show up with a flower picked along the way, a sweet she'd mentioned liking, or a folded note with a kind phrase. Simple gestures, but to Zoe, they were loaded with meaning, as she always believed love is built in the details. By his side, she felt she could be herself, without holding back words or hiding feelings. It was as if the safe space she'd always sought had finally materialized. But fate, silently, was already preparing twists she couldn't yet imagine. As the days passed, their conversations deepened. They talked about dreams, travels, and the kind of future they wanted. Daniel seemed to understand Zoe's goals and respect her ambitions. She began to picture herself by his side for many years, building not just a relationship, but a shared life. When someone sparks that kind of hope, it's hard to believe any shadow could be hiding behind such light. Her friends noticed a different sparkle in her eyes. Her mother, always cautious about her daughter's choices, said he seemed like a good guy, polite, hardworking, and respectful. This approval from her family only reinforced Zoe's belief that she was on the right path. After all, she had always waited for true love, and everything pointed to it finally arriving. But life, with its knack for changing plots abruptly, was already writing chapters Zoe could never have foreseen. And so, between coffees, laughter, and promises, Zoe let her heart open completely. There were no clear signs of a storm on the horizon, just the sweet illusion that she had found the love she'd always dreamed of. But the most striking stories rarely show their shadows at the start, and hers was about to begin unraveling. Cloudy Sunday, Square Cafe. Is kindness at the beginning a sign of character or strategy? Leave in the comments if you think everything. Is Rosie at the start, or if it's possible to spot red flags from the first meeting? In the beginning, Zoe felt happy to have found someone who seemed so present and attentive. Daniel always wanted to know how her day went, what she'd done, who she'd talked to. At first, it felt like genuine interest, a care she associated with love. But after a few months, the conversations began to take on a different tone. Small criticisms surfaced, almost disguised, about the clothes she chose to wear or the company of her longtime friends. Even though these remarks came with a smile or a gentle phrase, they lingered in her mind. It was as if, little by little, the colors of the relationship were shifting. The criticisms weren't constant at first, but appeared in moments that caught her off guard. One day, before heading to a birthday party, she heard from Daniel, "That skirt is too short for you." On another occasion, as she got ready for a lunch, he commented that he preferred seeing her in simpler clothes. These remarks came with a serious look and sometimes a heavy sigh, as if he were disappointed. Zoe tried to argue, but often ended up changing her outfit to avoid conflict. Deep down, she believed giving in on small things was just a way to keep the peace. Soon, the remarks went beyond her wardrobe. He started questioning why she needed to go out so much with her friends, hinting that a committed woman doesn't live on the streets. Gradually, Zoe found herself canceling plans and making excuses to avoid arguments. The presence of her friends was replaced by his constant company. Still, she tried to convince herself that this was just care and jealousy, that a bit of control was part of a passionate relationship. The calls became frequent, sometimes excessive. If Zoe took too long to answer, the phone would ring again, followed by short messages. "Where are you? Why didn't you answer?" At first, she responded promptly, thinking she was just reassuring her boyfriend. But over time, she noticed there was no room for a moment of silence without him noticing and questioning it. It was as if she were being watched all the time, even from afar. One day, while at the salon with a friend, her phone buzzed 6 times in a row. When she answered, she heard Daniel saying he was worried because he didn't know exactly where she was. Zoe tried to explain that she'd mentioned the salon the day before, but he countered that he liked to confirm. Once again, she justified to herself that this was just love, that he needed this attention to feel secure in the relationship. There were moments when Daniel made up for it all with affectionate gestures. After an argument, he'd show up with flowers, cook surprise dinners, or send heartfelt messages in the middle of the night. These moments eased the tension and, for a while, made Zoe forget the demands. It was as if each controlling act was erased by a display of affection, but the cycle repeated, and each time it felt a little tighter. Zoe still didn't see clearly what was happening. In her heart, she believed that when someone loves, it's natural to want to be close all the time, to care about every detail, to protect. That belief led her to give softer names to actions that little by little were shaping her freedom. But life would soon show her that care and control are very different paths. And at that moment, she was treading the more dangerous of the two. When love suffocates, it's no longer love. If you agree, comment with a heart and show that love is letting the other breathe. After a day of work, Zoe returned home. The night seemed ordinary, with the cool air signaling the end of another day in the town. Daniel was there, waiting, and the conversation started like so many others. Questions about her day, quick exchanges about weekend plans. But when Zoe mentioned she'd been invited by her friends to go out, the tone changed. A simple detail triggered stern looks, a raised voice, and a heavy atmosphere that spread through the room. The argument escalated unexpectedly. Harsh words went back and forth, and the space that once felt safe began to close in. Then, suddenly, the sharp sound of a slap broke the air. It took Zoe a few seconds to comprehend. Her face stung, but the real pain was much deeper. It was the shattering of a trust she believed was unbreakable. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. Daniel looked at her, his chest rising and falling with rapid breaths, and soon tears appeared. He said he didn't know what had come over him, that he'd lost control, and that it would never happen again. He touched her face with the same hand that had hurt her, begging for forgiveness, swearing it was just a moment of weakness. Zoe, still in shock, didn't respond. Part of her wanted to believe it was an isolated mistake. In the days that followed, the promise came with calculated gestures, flowers at her doorstep, unexpected gifts, heartfelt messages late into the night. Daniel said he loved her, that he couldn't bear the thought of losing her. These gestures stirred Zoe, who always believed love could overcome flaws. But at the same time, the memory of that night refused to fade. Her friends noticed the change. One of them, seeing a faint mark on Zoe's face, asked what had happened. Zoe responded quickly, saying she'd hit her head on a cabinet door. The lie came easily, almost automatically, as if protecting Daniel were the priority. It was simpler to make up an excuse than face the concern and questions. The cycle of affection and guilt continued. Daniel, at times sweet and attentive, at others intense and controlling. Zoe tried to convince herself that the loving version was the real one and that the other would never return. But without realizing it, she was already living a pattern that starts with small cracks and over time can break the entire structure. That first slap wasn't just a mistake. It was the clearest sign that love that hurts is never love. Forgiving the first slap is a path of no return. What would you do in Zoe's place? Would you forgive, believing it was a moment of loss of control? Or would you cut ties completely, knowing it wouldn't be the last? Share your opinion in the comments and let's keep this conversation going. Daniel's promises that he'd never raise his hand again unraveled quickly. There came shoves, grips on her arms, and insults that hurt as much as the physical blows. Threatening phrases became part of the routine. "If you leave me, I'll kill myself," he said with fixed eyes. "If you're with someone else, I'll kill him," he added, with a voice that left no doubt he might follow through. These episodes began to spill beyond the walls of their home and into Zoe's workplace. As a domestic worker, she spent her days cleaning a family's house, who always treated her with respect. But over time, her employer couldn't help but notice the signs. Bruises on her arms, faint marks on her face, slower steps, a tired look. At times she tried to talk, asking what had happened. Zoe, with a weak smile, would say she'd fallen or gotten hurt at work. These were ready-made lies, built to protect Daniel, or perhaps to protect herself from something worse if he found out she'd told the truth. Even when there were no new visible marks, her behavior betrayed that something was wrong. The attention she once put into her work gave way to distractions and forgetfulness. Her mind was no longer on household chores, but on trying to predict Daniel's mood to avoid the next outburst. The threats weren't limited to arguments. Sometimes they came via messages during work hours, stripping away any peace. Zoe's dreams, which once filled her heart with hope, began to fade. There was no time to think about the trip she wanted to take, the course she planned to start, or the house she dreamed of having. Daniel occupied every space, physically, with his constant presence, and mentally, with the fear and dread he left after each scene. Little by little, that relationship dimmed Zoe's light. Where there once was brightness, plans, and strength, now only scraps of courage remained to face the next day. To those looking from the outside, it might have seemed like mere exhaustion, but for her it was survival, a silent struggle against a prison with no bars, closing tighter each day. After months living under threats, Zoe realized there was no way to stay in that house. Each passing day, the feeling grew that she wouldn't survive the relationship. She spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine a way to escape without Daniel suspecting. Lagos came to mind as her only chance for a fresh start. A distant aunt lived there, and though they weren't close, she represented hope, and hope was all Zoe had left. The plan began discreetly. During the day, she made mental notes of what she could take. At night, she hid small pieces of clothing in the bottom of a bag, along with documents and a little money she'd saved from work. Everything had to be done in silence, as any noise could draw his attention. It was like walking through a minefield where each step required calculation and courage. On the night she decided to leave, her heart pounded as if announcing her fear. She placed the bag by the door, waiting for the right moment. But fate was cruel. Daniel arrived earlier than expected, and upon seeing the bag, his expression changed. Without a word, he went to the bedroom, pulled something from a drawer and returned with a gun in hand. The silence was now more threatening than any shout. His gaze was one of fury, but also possession. He said that if she tried to leave, there'd be nowhere in the world she could hide. Her hands trembled, but Zoe knew she couldn't back down. In a moment of distraction, she ran toward the door, feeling the cold night air hit her face. Behind her, heavy footsteps echoed, but courage propelled. Each movement, the tall grass became her refuge. Barefoot, with only the clothes on her back, she plunged into the dense vegetation, leaving behind everything she knew. Branches scratched her skin, stones bruised her feet, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the need to stay alive. The sound of crickets and rustling leaves mixed with the distant echo of Daniel calling her. Each step into the darkness was also a step away from the nightmare. Without knowing exactly where she was headed, she instinctively followed any light or sign of shelter. Adrenaline kept her body moving, but her mind began to feel the weight of the decision. Behind her lay a painful chapter. Ahead, an unknown that could be salvation or more danger. Zoe only knew that this time she wouldn't stop. Many women go through this every day, living as if they can't escape this abyss. Lack of information, financial difficulties, and even dependence on the abuser cause so many to stay silent and not report. Zoe didn't report. She chose to flee. What would you do? Would you report or flee? Share your answer in the comments and let's talk about it. The underbrush closed in on all sides. The sound of crickets and rustling leaves was her only company. The uneven ground punished her barefoot steps, and each one demanded more strength than Zoe seemed to have. Her mouth was dry, her tongue rough. She hadn't found potable water in 2 days, and her last meal was a distant memory, the heat during the day. And the cold at night made the journey even harsher. Her body ached, but it was her mind that began to give in first. The trees, once a shelter, now felt like the walls of an endless maze. At times, the wind carried faint smells of distant smoke or the muffled sound of an engine, but they always vanished before she could pinpoint their direction. Sometimes her vision blurred, and Zoe had to stop, lean against a tree, and breathe deeply to keep from collapsing. She pressed on, guided only by the hope of finding someone, until through the foliage, a different shape emerged. First a faint patch of light, then defined lines. Walls, windows, a roof, a farmhouse. Her heart raced, not from running, but from what that image represented. Shelter, food, perhaps safety. Dragging her feet, she approached along the dirt path leading to the large house. It was an imposing home, with a wide porch and white columns reflecting the soft light of late afternoon. Her legs, however, no longer obeyed. She climbed the steps with effort, feeling her body grow heavier with each movement. She tried to knock on the door, but her strength slipped away. The world spun. Zoe felt the cold wood against her skin, and before losing consciousness completely, thought only that if this was the end, at least it was in front of a place that seemed safe. She fainted, unaware that the house belonged to Adekunle Adebayo, a widower for 10 years, living in isolation not for lack of means, but to shield himself from the pain he carried in his chest. Adekunle hadn't withdrawn from the world by choice, but out of necessity. The death of his wife, Amina, was like a storm that tore away everything he knew. She passed in a sudden accident, leaving behind not only a house full of memories, but also a deep, silent wound. That day, Adekunle held her hand until her final breath, and the cold he felt when her fingers slipped away never left him. Since then, he chose to live for work and the land, believing silence was safer than the sound of a new loss. He didn't want to risk loving again, didn't want to allow himself the hope of building another family. Every corner of the house held a trace of Amina, the faint perfume in stored linens, the smiling photographs from times that seemed impossible to reclaim. Isolation was for him the only way to protect what remained of his heart. The muffled sound of something collapsing on the porch broke the silence reigning in the house. Opening the door, Adekunle found the young woman unconscious, her skin covered in dust, her long wavy hair matted to her face with sweat. Her chest rose and fell slowly, as if each breath demanded immense effort. Without hesitation, he knelt, lifted her in his arms, and felt her fragile, almost weightless body. It was like carrying not just a person, but an entire story he didn't yet know. With steady steps, he crossed the wide hallway to the guest room. The white walls reflected the soft light streaming through the windows, contrasting with her condition. He laid her on the bed, adjusted the pillow, and brought a damp cloth to clean her face. As he watched her, a bitter memory crossed his mind. It had been years since he'd cared for someone. That scene stirred something he'd tried to bury since Amina's death. When Zoe opened her eyes, the sight of the high ceiling and the feel of clean sheets confused her. She tried to sit up, but weakness held her back. Noticing she was awake, Adekunle entered with a simple plate, rice, beans, and a piece of boiled chicken. He asked her to eat slowly, as if fearing a sudden movement might shatter the fragile trust forming there. She thanked him with a shy nod, but avoided talking about how she'd ended up in that state. In the days that followed, Zoe regained her strength. Though she avoided mentioning the past, she showed gratitude in other ways. She began helping with chores around the house, sweeping the porch, washing dishes, tending to the plants that adorned the garden. Gradually, she extended her help to the farm tasks, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, organizing the kitchen after breakfast. Each gesture was a silent attempt to prove she deserved that shelter. Adekunle, accustomed to solitude, found the constant sound of light footsteps and soft voices filling the house strange. He still didn't know what had brought Zoe there, but he sensed something deep kept her silent. He chose not to press, having learned that some truths only emerge when pain finds a safe place to rest. Deep down, he also felt this young woman was changing something within him. Perhaps it was the way she looked out the window, as if searching the horizon for a piece of herself. Perhaps it was the simple way she devoted herself to tasks, as if finding meaning in small things. Whatever it was, the house no longer felt so empty, and the silence that once weighed heavy began to take on a new sound, the possibility of a fresh start. He didn't know her. She didn't know his past. But in the arms of a stranger, Zoe found what she needed most: peace. And you? Do you believe safety can come from the least expected places? Share in the comments. Zoe's presence in the big house began to raise eyebrows, especially since everyone knew the widower had lived alone for many years. The way she appeared there, without anyone knowing where she came from or who she really was, sparked suspicion among the workers and neighbors. Some whispered in the corridors, warning about the danger of sheltering a complete stranger. No one was sure of the young woman's intentions. Some suggested she might be taking advantage of inset system, Adekunle's generosity. Others spoke in hushed tones about risks, recalling that people with bad intentions rarely announce themselves. The whispers, though discreet, left a lingering question in the air. Was Zoe just a woman seeking shelter, or someone hiding something dangerous? One late afternoon, as the breeze carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee, Zoe overheard a conversation on the porch. One of the oldest workers spoke bluntly to Adekunle. "Sir, you've opened your home to a stranger. Do you know her intentions?" The words hit Zoe like stones. It wasn't just about what they thought of her. It was about the man who had taken her in, now exposed to suspicion because of her presence. At that moment, she realized her silence was no longer protecting her. Instead, it was fueling everyone's doubts. He deserved to know the truth after everything he'd done for her. So she decided she would tell her story to the widower, not to justify herself to others, but so that, from that moment on, he would have not only the responsibility of protecting her, but also the clarity of who he was protecting. The sun was setting behind the fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Zoe took a deep breath, trying to organize the words that weighed like stones in her chest. She walked over to Adekunle, who was silently watching the horizon, and with a soft voice asked, "Mr. Adekunle, could you sit with me on the porch for a bit? I need to tell you my story." He nodded, pulling a wooden chair close to hers. They sat side by side, and for a few seconds the only sound was the distant chirping of birds returning to their nests. Zoe gripped the hem of her dress as if seeking strength from something tangible, and began. "I am, or at least I was, a poor girl, but I never felt small because of it. I worked as a housemaid, cleaning homes to pay the bills. I didn't have luxuries, but I had dreams. I dreamed of graduating, having a better job, building a home of my own. I dreamed of having a family, children running in the yard, a future that was mine. Her voice wavered, but she continued. One day, love came, or at least, I thought it was love. He had an easy smile, sweet words. Daniel seemed like he'd come to protect me, support me. I believed I was living the start of a fairy tale, but she paused, her hands tightening in her lap. What began with flowers and promises turned into a nightmare. Zoe recounted the early changes in his behavior, the criticisms disguised as care, the constant calls, the questions about where she was and who she was with. She told him about the first time his hand struck harder than his words, and how apologies and promises that were never kept followed. She spoke of the shoves, the grips on her arms, the insults, and the threats that stole her sleep. If you leave me, I'll kill myself. If you're with someone else, I'll kill him. She took a deep breath, her eyes welling up. There came a moment when I didn't know if I'd survive the next time. I had no faith left, no strength. The only thing I had was to run. I left behind my home, my things, everything I had, and I ran. I ran without looking back, terrified he'd come after me with a gun, and that day would be my last. Adekunle kept his gaze fixed on her, his jaw clenched, as if each word was a blow he felt alongside her. Zoe discreetly wiped a tear and finished. I didn't know where I'd end up, and I ended up here. I didn't want to bring trouble to you, but I had nowhere else to go. Silence settled for a moment. Then he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and looked directly into her eyes. With a deep, steady voice, he said, Zoe, here, no one will lay a hand on you. As long as you're in this house, under this roof, no one will dare. I will protect you. You can rest easy. She felt the weight she carried shift, as if part of it had been lifted by his words. For the first time in a long while, she believed she might truly be safe. The night draped over the farmhouse like a soft blanket. The stars seemed closer, scattered across the dark sky like tiny lanterns. From inside the big house came the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Zoe appeared on the porch with a simple but carefully arranged tray, 2 steaming cups, and a plate with pieces of cornbread. I made coffee, she said with a light smile, placing the tray on the wooden table between the chairs. Adekunle, seated in the dim light, took a cup. The warmth of the drink heated his hands, but there was another kind of warmth, quieter, coming from the presence beside him. For a while they simply listened to the distant chirping of crickets and the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. Then he broke the silence. You know, Zoe, it's been many years since I've had company like this. His voice was deep but soft, as if each word carried the weight of memories. Since Amina, he paused briefly, as if saying her name still touched a wound. Past, the house has felt too big for me, big and empty. Zoe looked at him attentively, sensing the raw honesty in his words. It must have been hard, living like this alone all these years, she said, her tone more understanding than curious. He sighed, gazing at the sky, hard and tiring. You get used to not expecting anything, but he glanced at her, hesitating for a moment. Sometimes when you talk or when you laugh, it feels like this house is breathing again. Zoe lowered her face, her heart racing. She didn't know exactly what to say, but her hand resting on her leg, in a shy gesture of closeness, spoke for her. And she began, her voice almost a whisper. It's been a long time since I felt safe enough to sit like this, to talk, without fear of how the night will end. They looked at each other for a few seconds, and something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't yet declared love, but it was the beginning of something. The coffee slowly cooled in their cups as, on the porch, 2 people marked by their pasts began to find a new path, together, though they didn't yet know where it would lead. The nights on the porch became a habit. Between sips of coffee and conversations that stretched into the early hours, the barriers fell. A touch of hands, longer laugh, a gaze that lingered a few seconds more, until one night under a high moon and cool air, the distance between them dissolved. The kiss happened without warning, natural as the breeze passing by, and with it came the feeling that finally, a new chapter was beginning. But not every past is content to stay behind. Hundreds of kilometers away, Daniel discovered Zoe's whereabouts. The news hit him like a spark on dry gunpowder. He couldn't accept the idea of losing her. much less. Seeing her in someone else's arms, revenge took shape in his mind, cold and calculated. Armed and determined, he swore to himself that if Zoe wasn't his, she wouldn't be anyone's. And so, in the darkness of a silent night, he set out for the farmhouse with the weight of a deadly plan on his shoulders. The early morning fell heavily over the big house. Zoe and Adekunle were talking on the porch, unaware that the dirt road was already being traveled by someone driven by hatred. In the corral, one of the foremen noticed the approach of a motorcycle and the metallic glint at the rider's waist. The alert spread quickly, and within minutes, the farm's men were ready, scattered across the grounds, eyes sharp for any suspicious movement. Daniel didn't arrive with words. He arrived with shouts. Insults cut through the air before he even stepped foot on the ground. Zoe, recognizing him, felt her body go cold. Memories of terror-filled days flooded back. Adekunle stood immediately, positioning himself between her and the aggressor. The tension was palpable, the distance between them like a minefield about to explode. Daniel's first move was to draw his gun. The sharp sound of metal leaving the holster made the foreman move as a unit. For a brief moment, everything hung in suspense. The wind stopped, breaths held, and only the rapid beating of hearts could be heard. Then, the gunshot. The bullet grazed Adekunle's arm, burning his skin and drawing a low groan. But he didn't back down. The reaction was immediate. Two foremen rushed from behind, tackling Daniel to the ground. The gun fell into the grass, and a third man kicked it away. The struggle was brief, but intense. Pinned with his arms twisted, Daniel still tried to break free, shouting threats that sounded increasingly hollow. Within minutes, the local police, already alerted, arrived to take him away in handcuffs. The sight of him being placed in the patrol car was, for Zoe, like the door of a cell closing, this time on him. The silence that followed wasn't one of fear, but of relief. Zoe ran to Adekunle, carefully touching his wound. It wasn't serious, but blood stained his shirt. He gave a faint smile, trying to calm her, and said with the same firmness he'd used the day she told him everything. "I told you no one would touch you." In the days that followed, the farm's routine returned to its rhythm. But inside the big house, something had changed. Zoe no longer carried the weight of fear in her eyes. Adekunle, in turn, was beginning to discover there was still room for love after loss. Over time, the timid affection grew into companionship, and companionship into love. Months later, the porch that had witnessed their first kiss was decorated with simple flowers and long tables to welcome family and friends. The wedding took place there, under a sky that now seemed to bless their unlikely union. She wore a modest dress, but had the most beautiful smile the farm had ever seen. He wore a well-ironed suit, and in his eyes was the certainty that he had found a reason to open his heart again. Together, they rebuilt their lives. Zoe, who had arrived with nothing, now had a home, a partner, and the peace that once seemed impossible. Adekunle, who had resigned himself to solitude, learned that love can knock on the door even when it's been locked for years. And so, under the same starry sky that marked the beginning of it all, they moved forward, no longer as fugitives from the past, but as builders of a new future, where each day was proof that starting over is possible. Some stories aren't about escaping, but about finding a safe place to stay. Zoe didn't arrive at the farm to change the past. She arrived to rewrite the future, because when courage rises against fear, even the most locked doors open, and when one heart finds another that protects it, the whole world witnesses that love can still win. New stories are coming, so click the video below and dive into the next emotion. Until then,